Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Soulful Revolution. I'm your host, Lauren Grubaugh-Thomas, a priest, writer, spouse, and twin mama living on the homelands of the Arapaho and Cheyenne peoples, what's commonly known as Littleton, Colorado. My guest today is Lorraine Lam, whose pronouns are she, her. Lorraine is a Chinese-Canadian settler immigrant with an education in music, sociology, and social work. She's been a crisis outreach worker and case manager in the downtown east of Toronto for over 10 years, supporting people who are unhoused and precariously housed. And currently she works as a caseworker, supporting youth incarcerated for firearms charges. Lorraine, it's so good to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
I want to begin by inviting you to share about the question I ask all of my guests to share on, which is, what does it mean to you to be a soulful revolutionary? How do you inhabit this intersection of spiritual transformation and social change?
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about that coming into today because I was like, I don't think that's a question that I've ever been asked before. But when I think about, what it means to be soulful, I think a lot about embodiment, like doing the work for liberation, doing the work for whatever a revolution looks like with our whole beings, not just, like my body doing the things, but also like having my heart and mind fully in it. Because I don't think we can have a disembodied revolution. So that's kind of where my head goes when you talk about that and when you ask that question.
Well, I'm curious to hear more about embodiment. It sounds like your work is incredibly embodied, the work of supporting folks who are unhoused or precariously housed and incarcerated youth. Those all involve putting your body in positions and places that with people. And so tell me more. What does that work look like for you? How does that get embodied for you?
Yeah, I think for me, it's actually a big piece of it being embodied for me is like thinking about how I'm feeling in the day and being able to bring that with me into the work. I think I grew up, like when people talk about like, oh yeah, just like mind over matter, we're just going to grind through the day sort of thing. And while I am fully capable of just, grinding it and just putting your mind over, mind to things, I think that like we are called to bring our whole selves into the work that we do. And so I think for me, it's actually like just paying attention to what my body is saying on certain days, where my body is holding stress. And I think that there are certain days where I do show up doing the work feeling a little bit like, I'm just here with not my whole self and just a part of me, and being able to name that. And I think for me too, like as somebody who's figuring out like changes in my body as I'm like in my 30s and stuff too, it's also kind of like, oh, look, like how my menstrual cycle is affecting my mood is a thing that I'm starting to think like, hey, I have less energy to do certain things at certain times of the month. And that's okay. So it might mean that like there are certain times of the month where I'm not actually out in the community as much connecting with people because I just need to take a little bit of a slower pace. So I think for me, it's figuring out how to listen to what my body is needing, how I'm feeling that day, and bringing all of it in a way that works towards like not just seeing other people as full humans, but also like myself as a full human. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that piece about bringing your full self as a human being and honoring yourself is so resonant for me as somebody who is a quintessential helper. Like if you're familiar with the Enneagram, like I'm a 2, I am a helper through and through. And that's one of the challenges in doing helping work is that we can be out there helping other folks and not nourishing our own spirits, our own selves, our own bodies. And I've seen so many people burn out doing any kind of helping profession where they bring the passion, they bring the vision, and yet the nourishment and the care is not there in the same way for themselves. And so I hear that as being really essential.
Yeah, and I think like I am also a 2. So, I think just seeing as well that like when I'm not actually able to show up for myself fully, I'm not able to show up fully for other people either. And so I think that's been a really big lesson for me over the last number of years. Like I think seeing that like the passion and the desire to be there is all there. There's never a question about it. But I think my body is often saying like, no, like please stop for a second. And so then I think for me, embodiment in this work around like revolutions and like liberation is about listening to that as well, with the bigger picture in mind in terms of like not burning out and wanting to do this for the long haul, right?
Mm-hmm. I wonder what inspired you in doing this work in the first place.
That's a good question. For me, I grew up in a church setting with a solo parent. It was like super important for my mom that I went to church every week. I think the idea was if I did that, then everything would be fine in the world and I would be okay. I wouldn't make any crazy mistakes. Bless my mom. She did what she could and did her best. And I think for me, what always struck me growing up in church was these stories about, Jesus being with the people. And I think for me, I was always just like curious about why people ended up where they were. I think as a hardwired too, I was always just like, like I didn't like seeing people struggling. I remember watching this documentary years ago when I was 8 and the person died of cancer and I like bawled my eyes out and my mom was like, why are you crying? And I was like, what do you mean? Why am I crying? I think I've always felt things deeply and wanted to help. And it was when I was in my undergrad and I was studying downtown Toronto where, homelessness is very prevalent, very visible. And I remember having to go into this music store to buy my textbook. And I had to like step over this guy who was sleeping in the alcove of this store. And I was like, this is just so wrong in so many levels. And I would say that experience, plus I also grew up in the era of sandwich runs. Was that a thing for you? I don't know if that was a thing for you.
Is this a Canadian thing? Because it's new to me.
I'm going to explain this. So sandwich runs, oh my gosh, this was like youth group era, I don't know, 2000s or whatever it was. But like youth groups would like get together and we would make these sandwiches and like bring them to people who were outside.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe y'all didn't call them like sandwich runs.
That term is new to me.
yeah. I was like, no, surely you must know what I'm talking about. And I'll never forget, this is like the other second really formative experience for me was like, our youth group like had this extravagant dinner before we were going to make these sandwiches, right? Ooh. And then we made these sandwiches and I was like, okay, well, I wouldn't want to eat them. Yeah. And then I remember we were supposed to give everybody like a sandwich and a bottle of water. And I remember asking my youth group leader, why can't we just like bring some like Coke or Sprite and ask if people want that? And it was just kind of like this, no, we're just going to give water and sandwiches. And I was like, something about this doesn't feel great. And so I think those two were really formative things for me in terms of like, okay, hold on. Like something about this is not the way it should be. And and so I think I just started trying to find ways to get involved in terms of what it looked like to help people. I use help, kind of in quotations because sometimes I'm aware that my perception of helping is not actually helpful. And that's kind of how it all started. I got to know people who were living outside, people who became like my friends and my neighbors. And here we are, still doing it like 15 years later.
Tell me about some of those initial relationships, like who people were and how you encountered them, how the trust was built. I think that's the piece I'm really curious about is, when folks are thrown away by society, when people are rendered disposable by society, there is understandably such a lack of trust that a lot of people have in being able to like establish connection with people who are not in the same circumstance or really with anybody. I mean, that's been my experience is often trust is really hard won. And which totally makes sense when folks have been disposed of. And so I'm curious about your experience of trust and these relationships with folks who you came to see as your friends, your neighbors through building relationship together.
Yeah, I think I will definitely name that as, when I dove into this community when I was 18, as a racialized young female presenting person. I don't present as a threat to people in the same way that, like, if I was, a male presenting person, maybe like a white man or something, right? Like, I don't represent the same kind of authority or power. And I think that definitely is a big piece in terms of initial barriers, or kind of overcoming initial barriers that might exist in terms of trust building. I think for me, like, what happened actually was I showed up at this drop in the soup kitchen and I was like, I'm gonna like help. And they were like, great, come and help like make a salad, cut up a beet salad. And I was like, yeah, I can do that. But I was like, I don't actually know what beets are because I didn't grow up eating beets in my Chinese household.
Sure.
So I went to like the back where all the veggies were and I was like, process of elimination. Broccoli, not that. Cauliflower, not that. I took like some round root vegetables and I was like, surely this must be it. And I started chopping up these veggies. And then the kitchen lady was so kind. And she was like, oh, what are you doing? I was like, oh, okay, something's wrong here. And I was like, oh, I'm making that beet salad you asked me to make. And she's like, oh, those are turnips.
An understandable mistake.
Yeah. I was like, oh, okay. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I know. So lesson number 1, I thought I was going to help and I created more work. And she was like, you know what? Maybe you're better suited to just go talk to people in the dining room. And I was like, oh yeah, okay. And the dining room was mostly people who had been sleeping rough the night before, who came in for breakfast the next morning. And honestly, I initially was just like, I can't do that. Like, what am I going to say to people? What am I going to, like, hey, how's your day going? Like, you just slept outside in the middle of winter. Your day is probably not going so good. But I ended up just showing up the same several days a week, like Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, showed up at the same time, sat at the same spot in the back of the room, and got to know the people who all sat at the same spot in the back of the room at that time. And truthfully, I would say the initial relationship didn't involve a lot of talking. It was a lot of like, we just read our newspapers and sometimes, hey, do you know what the crossword answer to this is, kind of thing. And I think it was over time with consistency that people started being like, hey, like, what are you doing here? And I was like, funny you ask. I was going to help, but here we are. And as people started to share their stories, there was a curiosity about my story as well, which I would say at first I was kind of embarrassed to share, right? I was like, I'm a pretty privileged housed university student, probably very different life experiences than yours. And you're sleeping outside. And some of the first people that I met were Indigenous people who were survivors of the 60s scoop, had experienced all of the trauma in their families around residential schools. And I was like, I don't know, like, we have nothing that we share. But yet, I think as we got to know each other, we discovered a lot of similarities in terms of things we liked and things we didn't like and things we cared about. And one of the guys, he actually was like, hey, you want to come see some of the spots where we like hang out? And I was like, oh, wow, like what an invitation. In hindsight, maybe wandering off with a stranger to like go check out where they like, sleep was not a great idea. But that's kind of how it started. And I think over time, there was a feeling of like, these guys looked out for me and I felt really protective over what people said about this community. And I think that's kind of how things continued. Yeah.
Yeah, the language that gets used to talk about folks who are unhoused shapes our imagination in really profound ways. And I wonder what language you have found in relationship with folks to be really humanizing and dignifying language. What do people appreciate?
When I started getting to know the guys at the back table, a really big shift was when one of the guys greeted me one morning and was like, yo, sis, how's it going? And I was like, did you just refer me like as sis? And I think that was one of the first things for me where I realized like, hey, you know what? Like you see me as your kin. And I think in so much of our world, it's easy to distance ourselves from what we call social issues when we just label them as issues instead of seeing the things as people. So when we talk about homelessness as, oh, homelessness is an issue, as opposed to, hey, my street brother who is sleeping in the stairwell tonight, and why have we created a system that has allowed for that to happen? That changes, right? Or even things like, in my city right now in Toronto, there's a lot of vitriol towards people living in tents, and we refer to tents cities or encampments. But something shifts if you say, like, these are actually my neighbors who actually live in these tents. So I think language is a really intentional shift, and people, um, you know, I think there's a sense of honor and dignity that people can claim for themselves when they're referred to as, I'm your neighbor, I'm someone's uncle, like I am your, you know, so and so that down the street, right? Like, hey, I'm the guy that like goes around the neighborhood and collects all the empties after a weekend, right? Like,
Mm.
as opposed to just another homeless person or all the other names that we hear.
Mm. Yeah, there's the language of disposability, and then there's the policy that grows out of that. And at least in the US, I'm curious to hear about in Canada, there's increasingly disposability policy that's being implemented. I heard a story recently about Governor Gavin Newsom in California going to an encampment of unhoused folks and throwing away their things. Just the governor of California going and participating in a police sweep of a community,
Yeah.
and throwing away their things, which, the little bits that I've worked with folks who are unhoused and folks like, and people who are working poor, etc. Like, if you lose your ID, it's so incredibly difficult to get another one. There's so many hoops you have to jump through just through the basic necessities of navigating society, like an identification card.
Yeah.
And so, what are you observing and what are you experiencing within the community that you inhabit when it comes to policy? And I guess the political shift, like the language tends to match up with the ways that politically we enact systems on people. Are there some parallels in Canada, and what are the efforts that are being made to resist that?
It's interesting that you talk about these sweeps in California, because recently in Ontario, so the state that I live in, a number of big mayors just came together to sign this petition, essentially to say that they want our state to start implementing involuntary treatment laws as a way to deal with homelessness in tents. And they actually, one of the things that they cited for why they think it's appropriate to do so is they actually cited Grants Pass, which we have seen enacted so violently in California right now. I would say that, like, what I'm seeing in terms of like the systems that we have created, I I really, really wish that people would stop villainizing people and would instead critique the things we have set up in the first place that make it impossible for people to live. I appreciate that you named like the IDs, for instance. Like, I think a lot of us have experienced like losing our wallets and then we're like, oh my gosh, I have to like get my things replaced, right? Like, we know that experience for ourselves, but yet when it's like somebody else's IDs being thrown out, we seem to just not have an issue with that. And there is something that is really, I think, again, like rooted in the language that we've created that like really distance ourselves. Oh, well, it would never happen to us, not us, but maybe those people did something. And that's why it's almost like the idea of like deserving what happens to you, which is tied into all these narratives around like, oh, if you just work harder, or like, all of those things, which are full of assumptions in terms of, well, it's actually like people work really hard to survive when they live outside. Like, it's no one's slacking off to survive these days, right? Yeah. And but it does, I think, come from a place of and my experiences, I think people are also just afraid maybe of it happening to them, and so maybe it feels easier to just put themselves at a distance. But your question was really around like systems and policies that continue. And I think what I'm seeing here, in Toronto and Canada, there is such a frustration in terms of how things are going. People are struggling in terms of, it's expensive to live. They're experiencing like the crunch of overlapping traumas from the last number of years. And what's curious to me is that, it feels like at every turn we have this opportunity to say like, hey, maybe we need to create a different system.
Mm-hmm.
But instead what we've done is, no, we're going to double down on the system and blame somebody else instead.
Yeah.
And one of the big things that I see is around the language towards immigrants and migrant workers, right? I think there's this narrative and rhetoric that's being spewed here that it's those immigrants,
Mm-hmm.
those migrant workers that are coming and taking the things away from us, which truthfully is like all of the research we know is not true. Like there's no migrant workers coming here and buying a property. If anything, they have no rights.
Yeah.
But instead of changing the system that, is around the financialization of housing and, minimum wage is not livable, we're saying, no, it's those people and it's not us. And so now we're creating this continuing language of dehumanization against groups of people instead of changing policies. Or rather, we're enacting policies that further demonize groups of people instead of actually, I think, taking a hard look at how we got here in the first place and how we've been complicit in some of these systems in the first place.
Yeah, you're describing that inner work, the self-interrogation of ourselves, of our systems, of the narratives that we tell, which is such deep spiritual work. And our political systems often don't want to begin to even touch that. That's I think like that's like one of the myths of, separation of church and state being perpetuated, because we don't want to do the spiritual work of examining the baked in sins in our society and in ourselves around racism and colonialism and genocide and patriarchy. Like these are all systems that are baked into our society and that we internalize in different ways to different degrees. Yeah.
I think one of the stories growing up that I heard repeatedly was, the story of the Good Samaritan, right? And I've always been struck by how we always want to identify ourselves as the Good Samaritan. Yes. Or at the very least, we know that that's who we strive to be. But I think over the years, the more I think about this story, the more I realize, in that story, whenever we talk about it, we talk about the Good Samaritan, we talk about the person who was left on the side of the road, we talk about the people who walked by, but we never talk about like the robbers. The robbers who left the man in the ditch in the first place. And the more I think about it, the more I'm like, we are the robbers. The church in particular are the robbers. I mean, in some quite literal ways, in terms of how we robbed our indigenous kin of their land and culture. And, that trauma continues today. But we have really stood behind policies that have robbed people of their life and dignity. And then to then pretend like we are the Samaritans, I think, is really dishonest. And so I think some of the stuff to your first question actually around what embodiment means, I think there is a piece of embodiment that is about holding up the mirror to ourselves too and saying like, what am I embodying today that is actually like the Good Samaritan, and in what ways have I actually been the robber today, and what does it look like for us to like name that and like not just be guilty about it, but then be like, okay, like what does it look like then to move forward and do things differently, right? And my frustration with the church is always like we're not great at at collective acknowledgement of the harm that we continue to cause.
Right. That piece of seeing all the different characters in the story and being able to like ask ourselves, am I this person? Am I this person? Am I this person? Is like, oh, it's such an important practice. And yet I think this is such a like Western colonial framework, is really seeing ourselves as the hero, and how, we get into that, and that gets internalized in, I think, all of us, again, to different degrees, depending on how we identify and the different identities that we carry. But it's so potent, like wanting to be the hero of the story, wanting to be the helper. I had a recent conversation with a podcast guest who works with immigrants as a lawyer, and she talked about how she cautions her students who are training to be lawyers and work with her. She cautions them not to see themselves as taking on responsibility for, as caring for people out of a place of responsibility, but rather out of love. but and then a sense of like you were describing, Lorraine, the sense of community, that we are neighbors and we belong to each other and we're like collectively going to flourish or suffer based on our care for one another, that there's a mutuality that's there. So even that language around helping and responsibility can be really problematic. And that's Good Samaritan. The story of the Samaritan is one that can be used. In fact, I heard Kamala Harris use that story just a few weeks ago. She was talking to a group of Christians and she invoked the story of the Good Samaritan to talk about, being good Samaritans. And that's how it gets framed. But the whole point of that story is to offer a group of people who were held with derision, who were seen as scapegoats, who were seen as outsiders, to offer a different angle of them as humans, as fully humanizing, fully embodying, fully, fleshing them out, and not allowing us to throw them away. So yeah, I so appreciate that you bringing that story in, because these sacred stories that are passed down in our religious traditions can be really like dumbed down and overly simplified in our culture. But they continue to offer opportunity to reflect and to challenge the ways that we think about how we care for each other, how we show up as neighbors.
Yeah. I mean, like, sometimes I think about like, okay, so if we were to write a 2024 version of the Good Samaritan, like the Good Samaritan who showed up, they are the Palestinian woman that's like nameless right now. That's, we see her pain all the time, but aren't stopping a genocide, right? Or the Good Samaritan is actually like the neighbor in the tent who like, gave his jacket to somebody who needed it more. And so, yeah, I really appreciate your framing of like, actually, it's not just about being the Good Samaritan. It's actually like talking about like the people that are discarded are actually like the ones that are centered and are the ones that we have much to learn from. Mm-hmm.
Well, and it sounds like that is a huge part of what nourishes and energizes you in the work is your relationships with the communities that you serve. And that's a good turning point to talk about the other community that you serve, the youth who are incarcerated for firearms possession. Tell me about them and how you found yourself into that work and what energizes you in doing that work with that community.
Yeah, I think I have always been, in my work with people who are unhoused, I have gotten to know a lot of people over the years who have had so many interactions with the incarceration system. People who come out of jail and just are on the streets, like they're worse off than they were before they were incarcerated. And I've always been really curious about sort of like, okay, what did we think was going to happen by locking people up, right? And in my experiences as well with people who have been incarcerated, those were some of the most profound conversations were had sometimes with people where, I guess people are locked up and they have so much time to write, so much time to think. And I got to get to know a lot of people over the years when they were inside. Because of that, people were writing letters and processing things that they didn't quite have the safety to do when they were outside trying to survive on the streets. And I, think a lot about what it means, when we talk about being the light in the world that we live in. Prison's a pretty dark place. And so I think a lot about like, how do we find glimmers of light in here? And so I think I've always been really drawn to what supporting people while they're inside could look like. And yeah, so my work in this role, honestly, was a bit of like actually it was Instagram. Instagram that actually was like, hey, this place is looking for someone to join your team. And it feels like an extension of the work that I've already been doing in terms of working with people who are unhoused. There's a lot of patterns in terms of how people end up in these spaces. I use the word choice very, very lightly because I would say that people didn't really have a lot of choices, right? Some of the people that I work with had to choose between, their family going hungry or they were going to try to steal to eat, which again, I think we know this abstract, like oh, if somebody was hungry and they stole, like, do we think this is like a moral issue? And yet this is reality for so many people and for some of the youth that I work with. And we're in this time right now, especially where I live, where there's this idea that people are unhoused or poor because of choices that they've made. Therefore, if we lock them up, they will somehow get better and then come out and become, quote, productive members of society. And I would say, like, this thinking is so flawed and so rooted in ableism and racism and classism and all of those things. And so in my work now, working with people who are incarcerated, we think a lot about, okay, so you're here because you had to make certain decisions, but ultimately it's really important for me anyway that the people that I'm supporting know that they are so deeply, deeply loved, that they are not like their worst mistakes, which to me is actually like the essence of who Jesus and what the gospel is about. And honestly, with some of the guys that I'm working with, we're not really, quote, working on anything. It's not like we're like, actively working on housing stuff or anything, but it's so much about presence. And for me, like, that is, I think a lot about, like, when we read about how Jesus, lived his life on earth, he could have just like, gone to every single place and just like, threw bread and fish at everyone, like Oprah style, bread for you, fish for everybody. But like, I think what really stands out to me is the way that he took the time to connect with people with no agenda. He didn't walk around looking at people as projects to like, fix their issues and stuff, but he was just so good at being present with people. And it was so clear that that's what really mattered. And so I think for me, like in this work with people who are incarcerated, it's really important to me that they know that, they just matter in this place of really like, it's really dark. But also realize that like we've built a lot of systems that have kind of pushed people to have to make some of these choices that have landed them here now. And then if we talk about what hope is, then it's like, okay, how do we become active practitioners of hope to figure out like what does the next 30 years of your life look like? Because if you're 25 now and you do another 10 years, you're going to get out when you're 35, and that's supposed to be your prime, but maybe you've never been able to have some opportunities to try to even build your life before. So those are some of the things for me that I think a lot about in that work, in that world, that I think overlap with, supporting unhoused people as well.
Yeah. I hear what you're describing with both unhoused folks and with youth who are incarcerated, a liberatory politic. And I'm curious about the language that you would use to describe your politics and how they've been shaped by the communities that you serve, the communities that you support and are part of. I'm curious how these relationships that are so grassroots and interpersonal, how has that affected the way that you see large scale issues and systems, and how we might legislate, not only legislate, but how we as people might come together collectively to create change.
I think like I grew up definitely sort of with this idea that like only certain people get into politics, that politics was like this separate thing we never talk about, especially in the church, right? Like, ooh, we don't talk about that. But, how do we claim to love our neighbor but not care about the systems that are killing our neighbors in the first place? How do we love our neighbors without working to dismantle the same things that are keeping our neighbors stuck? Like, what good is your food bank or your sleeping bag drive if we're gonna keep upholding policies that keep people homeless in the first place? Like, we should really be working towards a place where we don't need to rely on food banks and sleeping bag drives. So I think for me, like, this idea of politics became so personal because I was seeing like the impact that policies had on people's lives.
Yeah.
I was seeing what minimum wage policies were doing in terms of keeping people hungry. I was seeing what the war on drugs was doing on substance users and their families. Like, for me, like, politics is framed used to be framed as a very abstract thing, but if anything, now I think I see like our everyday is a politic in terms of what we choose to engage in, how we choose to spend our time, and who we fight for and who we amplify. I I think that one of the biggest shifts for me is that like politics is always seen as a very macro institutional thing, but more and more for me, politics feels really micro and interpersonal. Um, and I have to wonder, like, if everybody engaged, it's interesting because I think a lot of people in my world think about politics as just voting, right? And I think a lot about like if we were to just stop thinking about politics as a one day every 4 years event, but like thought about it as like, oh my gosh, like why is my neighbor Sam's, rummaging through my garbage can for food? What can we do to change that? I just feel like we would make such different systems. And then like everybody would thrive. I think some of this, it's just moving away from this scarcity mindset that we don't have enough and therefore we have to take from each other. And clearly it's not getting us anywhere. So I just have a yearning for an imagination of something different than just status quo and how we've been doing things.
Who are some of the folks that you look to as mentors, as guides, as the lights on the path ahead for you in this work?
That is a really good question. And I think my answer changes seasonally based on how things are feeling. I think right now, as I'm speaking with you, this week I've been thinking a lot about Rosa Parks. And I feel like, everybody kind of knows Rosa. She decided, no more, I'm not going to sit in the back of the bus. But I think a lot about if I could have a conversation with her, I just want to know, were you planning this day for some time? Did you just get fed up one day, and just decided? But then I also think about all the people who came before her who tried to sit at the front of the bus. Those are the people I think right now in this season of my life are the people that are kind of inspiring me to keep going. Because I think they probably made those decisions to try to sit at the front of the bus knowing what they were pushing for, but not knowing what the outcomes would be. And they were willing to put their bodies on the line. We'll never know their names, not all of them anyway. But they created enough of a movement that clearly inspired Rosa Parks to do what she did, which then ignited the entire movement around civil rights. So when I think about where we're at now and the state of how things feel locally and also internationally, I think a lot about the people that we never hear about who are making those daily decisions to be like, you know what, I'm going to sit in the front of the bus today, put my life on the line. And a lot of those people that I know who have been brutally punished for it by the state, but they're still doing it. And I'm like, okay, we are hopefully moving towards a moment where maybe a Rosa Parks is going to be one day we're going to get so fed up and we're going to do something different. And then maybe we're going to ignite something different. I think those are people that are keeping me going right now. I would say too, there are a lot of people in my personal life who I've been doing this work with for some time, who nobody would know outside of my circles. But there are people who have been doing this work for the last 10, 20 years and are still doing it. I would say those are friends that I have in my life that are really inspiring me to kind of look ahead. So they're not really historical figures, but they're definitely figures that I look to.
Yeah. I love that you invoke the story of Rosa Parks and the Birmingham bus campaign, because one of the stories that a lot of folks don't know is that Claudette Colvin was somebody who refused to leave her seat on the bus. And then Rosa Parks was selected by the growing movement organized by Dr. King and lots of other organizers who were the strategists behind the movement. But she was selected as here's the most strategic person that we could put in this position. So no one talks about Claudette Colvin. people don't know about Claudette, but she was really the instigator, who really was the person who said, like, I'm just done. And then that led to this teasing out of a longer term strategy that involved Rosa, and it involved all the folks in the Black community who had cars, driving other people to work. It involved this whole network of care, of mutual aid, in order to support that direct action lasting for a year. And all those people who are nameless were no less important than Rosa Parks, like the people, or Dr. King, like the people that we don't read about in the history books, played an essential role, including Claudette and the role, the courage that she had to play the role that she did. And it's such a hopeful thing for me to think about all those people, all those ancestors, and also all like you, all my friends, all the folks who are so vital for me in setting my vision straight on the work ahead and continuing to have courage and to be supported. And again, I think it comes back to this like hero worship of our culture, that we can think, oh, it's just that one person. It's the Rosa Parks, it's the Dr. King, etc. When in fact, it's such a constellation of care, the way that we all have our little light that we shine, and we're connected to this bigger picture that we can't even see in our own lifetime, that we don't have the distance to be able to recognize, the role that we may be playing. But of course, all those people are invaluable, in your work, in your life, as guiding lights keeping you going. That's so beautiful.
Mm-hmm. I think about Deepa Iyer. Like, I think she just, has that social change ecosystem, that's out there right now. And I really appreciated the different roles that people can play, and it's all important. And I think sometimes, again, like in our very strange, like social media, celebrity culture, hero loving kind of ways, we forget actually, like, it's not just like one or two people that are gonna like take us to liberation. Like, we all play a different part, and we have to. And I think a lot about what it means for us to know that, and then like plug into that. And I think that's kind of like something that I'm thinking about in terms of like, okay, so like, what now? Right? Like, where do we all tap in? Like, it's so important more and more to, like, I don't know. I'm hoping people are seeing how important it is to plug into collective communities of care, because at the end of the day, like, that's what we've got, right? Like, if my house is flooding, I have my neighbors. They're the ones that are going to come help me out. So where are we plugging into those local pockets? And I think sometimes, I know for me, like, it's easy to get lost in like the bigness of so many big things that feel really overwhelming. But I think, like, that there are people in my life, and also like to your referencing around the Birmingham bus movement, right? In terms of just the collectiveness of everybody buying into the same vision and doing their small part. That was actually a really big part. I think a lot about what it means for us then to move forward. We're recording this the day after election stuff, right? And people are holding many different feelings, but like, okay, and then what? And like, if we're not plugged into communities of care and organizing, like, there's no more urgent time than now to like figure out where we can plug in, right?
I'm realizing as we're talking about Birmingham, I'm going, Lauren, no, it's Montgomery, but
oh yeah, that's right.
So all the respect to the Montgomery bus boycott organizers. But yeah, I love that reminder that there's a place for everyone. There's a role for everybody, and for every community. I think there's ways that we look toward, I don't know, big cities, and think that, they're going to be the ones to lead the way. And there's also roles for people in small towns and in rural settings and in the suburbs, and figuring out what's the way that we build a community of care and a network of care. I think about my own suburban community, and the fact that on our neighborhood social media pages, that there's been a couple experiences of, somebody being in the neighborhood who is a stranger, that is not recognized, who may not be wearing who may be wearing clothes that people then judge as shoddy, as not put together. And there's been these moments where like somebody will post saying, "Oh, I saw this person in the neighborhood." And then there's like this chorus of people going, "Why are you judging that person based on what they're wearing? Why are you not going up and talking to them and asking their name? Why did you take a photograph of that person?" Like this, this horrible like NIMBYism that happens in suburban communities because of the legacy of redlining and white flight. That there are folks who are like not willing to engage with their neighbors who might be struggling, or having, mental health challenges or what have you. But it's been so encouraging to see the chorus of care and support come alongside and say, that person is our neighbor too. And we need to come together to support them and get to know them. And so I hear in what you're describing, just the relational basis for everything. And perhaps as a final story, I wonder if you'd leave us with an example of a time that you reached out to somebody who was having a hard time, and what came of that exchange for you and for them.
I think that one of the things that comes to mind right away actually is as things after October 7th started unfolding and we started witnessing this genocide happen, there were a lot of rallies and marches and protests that were happening in my city. And I remember going to them being like, okay, great, I'm really glad I'm here. And then looking around being like, I wonder where all my like Christians are. Where is everybody?
Same.
It's really disheartening. And I remember just kind of holding that to myself for a little bit, because the question of where are all the Christians at has been like an ongoing chorus in my life for so many things. But I was like, okay, this is just one more thing. And I remember going to one of the rallies and coming home one night a couple months ago. This was like in the earlier this year, in January, February, something. And I was just like, processing, doom scrolling in Instagram as we do sometimes. And I saw a friend of mine post something that was darker than what was normal for her. And it alluded again to stuff happening around Palestine and how she felt really alone in where she was at. And so I reached out to her and just kind of was like, hey, like, what's on your mind? Like, seeing this. We started talking, and I realized, I didn't even know this actually at the time, but I realized that she was a person of faith, and she was really struggling because she was looking around in her circles of people that she was going to church with, and was like, none of these people were showing up, and she just, felt really bad. But from those conversations came a lot of what would it look like to just like find more people like us. And long story short, we now have started like a little chapter of Christians for a Free Palestine Toronto.
Wow. That was the seed of organizing.
Seed.
Wow.
Yeah, that was a seed. And I think that it was a moment for me where I was like, okay, there's permission for us both to feel really, really bummed out about things, really disappointed in the church, really angry at the people supporting a genocide. Also not knowing where to channel that sadness and anger. But, at the same time, seeing my friend Alicia is part of Christians for a Free Palestine in the States, and seeing the work that was happening there. And it was like, hey, it's possible. We can do something like that here. And so, our little group, we've started now. We've done some really cool things around the long-term decolonization of Western theology, which I think is really important. We've created a little space for people to process and be together. We've been able to gather people across the state or province to march together. So that feels like a thing, I would say, where, reaching out to somebody, having a bad time, birthed like a new baby of something that feels hopeful in the midst of all of the bad and all of the heaviness.
Thank you for sharing that story. I love to hear examples of the small acts of love that end up bearing fruit And we don't always get to see what fruit will be born of the seeds that we plant, but sometimes we do. And it's such a gift to be able to see not only that interpersonal interaction with your friend and what that meant to her and to you, but then to see it grow into a space to hold other people who are longing to be of service, who are longing to be in solidarity and to be challenging these structures of oppression. So what a beautiful seed you planted that's beginning to grow.
And I appreciate you naming that. Like, we might not know what the seed grows into. I think one of the most important teachings that I've learned working in the community with people who are unhoused is one of my first friends in this community, his name is Steve. He taught me about like the 7 generations teaching in Ojibwe culture, indigenous culture. To think about every decision that you make affects the next 7 generation, but also like we think about the 7 generations that came before us that led us to here. And I think sometimes in this work of, justice work, liberation work, whatever we want to call it, like, of course I want to see results tomorrow. But it's a really helpful reminder for me that like sometimes our job is just to plant the seed and like pour the water where we can and like hope that it grows into something for the next 7 generations. Because I'm the fruit of something that came 7 generations before me. And I think that helps me also put some perspective in terms of like, no, I'm not the hero in this story. We're all like doing this together. So yeah, that's a great reminder. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for offering that insight. It's been so good to have you on the show today. Thank you for your presence, for your wisdom, and for the soulful revolutionary work that you do.
Thanks, Lauren. It was so good to be here.